The downpour had been relentless since dawn, turning the high-rise windows of the financial district into blurred sheets of gray. Inside the penthouse boardroom of Whitmore Access, the atmosphere was completely detached from the storm outside, preserved in an expensive, climate-controlled silence. Ava Whitmore sat at the apex of the massive court's conference table. She was 38 years old, possessing a striking, sharp-edged beauty and an aura of absolute authority that kept her executives frozen in their seats. For 20 years, she had steered this billion-dollar medical logistics empire from a custom carbon fiber wheelchair. To the business world, she was an untouchable force. To the medical community, she was the definitive case study of permanent, irreversible spinal paralysis. On the other side of the city, the morning had begun with a different kind of tension. Nathaniel Hayes stood in the cramped kitchen of a drafty apartment on Crestview Lane, packing a simple lunchbox. He was 34, a man of large build and quiet, deliberate movements, wearing a faded canvas jacket. His 7-year-old daughter, Sophia, sat at the table, watching him try to fix her uneven pigtails. Nathaniel knelt beside her, his large, calloused hands gently taking over, smoothing her dark hair with a tenderness that contradicted his rugged appearance. The rent was overdue, and the tuition fee for Sophia's specialized reading program at Elmwood Academy weighed heavily on his mind. But looking at his daughter, his expression remained perfectly calm, a steady anchor. He kissed her forehead, promised to pick her up at 5, and stepped into the rain to begin his delivery route. By 4 in the afternoon, Nathaniel's left knee was throbbing from carrying heavy crates up a broken loading dock ramp. His final stop was the Whitmore Access Tower, a towering monument of steel and glass that dominated the skyline. He carried a single, weatherproof courier envelope marked for immediate hand delivery to the chief executive officer. The receptionist at the lobby airily waved him toward the private elevator. When the elevator doors glided open on the top floor, Nathaniel stepped directly into the high-stakes boardroom meeting. The room was thick with anxiety. Charles Whitmore, Ava's 62-year-old uncle and the company's senior vice president, was standing near the projection screen, aggressively reprimanding 2 department heads over a delayed shipping report. Ava sat perfectly still at the head of the table, her face an unreadable mask of cold discipline. Nathaniel walked in quietly, intending only to drop the document on the side table and leave. But Charles, looking for an outlet for his frustration, turned his wrath toward the newcomer. Charles openly sneered, demanding to know why a dripping delivery man was allowed into a private executive briefing. He walked over, deliberately knocking Nathaniel's clipboard to the floor, splashing water across his own polished leather shoes. Charles pulled a $20 bill from his pocket, tossed it onto the wet floorboards, and told Nathaniel to clean up his mess and get out before he had him blacklisted from every courier service in the city. The room went dead silent. The executives looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to cross Charles. Nathaniel didn't move. He didn't look down at the money, nor did he show a flash of anger. His quiet masculinity and innate dignity remained completely unshakable. He simply stood his ground, looking directly at Charles with a calm, penetrating gaze that made the older man visibly uneasy. As Nathaniel reached down to retrieve his dropped clipboard, a sudden, massive rumble of thunder shook the building, causing a low-frequency vibration to ripple through the floorboards. The executives flinched, but Nathaniel's eyes, trained by years of intensive physical therapy studies before his life had been derailed by tragedy, caught something entirely different. He looked at Ava's feet. Beneath the sharp tailoring of her trousers, her left calf muscle distinctly contracted. The toes of her left foot curled inward against the metal footrest, a precise, microcellular, muscular response to the floor's vibration. It lasted less than a second, a fleeting reflex that everyone else in the room missed because they only saw her as a powerful icon. But Nathaniel saw a living, breathing body reacting to its environment. He stood up slowly, ignoring Charles entirely, his eyes locking onto Ava's guarded, icy gaze. The entire room held its breath, expecting the deliveryman to apologize and retreat. Instead, Nathaniel's deep, steady voice broke through the corporate tension.
"You are not completely paralyzed, Miss Whitmore."
The words fell like a physical blow. Charles's face instantly drained of color, moving past irritation into an expression of raw panic. He lunged for the security console on the wall. Ava went terrifyingly still, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white, staring at Nathaniel as if he had just shattered the very foundation of her entire existence. Security guards in dark corporate suits burst through the heavy mahogany doors within 45 seconds of the alert. Charles was shouting, his voice cracking with a strange, high-pitched desperation as he pointed a trembling finger at Nathaniel. "Get this lunatic out of my sight! Revoke his courier clearance immediately! Call the police!" Nathaniel did not flinch. He did not offer any physical resistance as the guards grabbed his arms. He simply locked his eyes with Ava's, stepping backward with an innate, quiet dignity that made the frantic shouting in the room seem small. Just before the threshold of the boardroom, he paused, his deep voice cutting through the chaos like a knife through thin ice. "If I'm wrong, Miss Whitmore, forget I ever breathed a word," Nathaniel said softly, his steady gaze refusing to let her look away. "But if I'm right, then someone has stolen 20 years of your life." The heavy doors clicked shut behind him. The boardroom remained frozen in a suffocating vacuum. The department heads stared straight down at their digital tablets, terrified to look up or make eye contact. Charles was breathing heavily, smoothing his silk tie with shaking hands, trying to laugh it off as the delusional rambling of a low-class street worker. But Ava did not hear her uncle. She did not look at the quarterly profit spreadsheets still flashing on the projector screen. She was staring down at her own lap, her entire mind trapped in a terrifying, sudden echo of a muscle contraction she hadn't felt since she was 18 years old. The fourth-floor apartment in the converted industrial district smelled of cinnamon, old floorboards, and damp coats. Nathaniel climbed the concrete stairs slowly, his injured left knee clicking slightly with every step. The sound of his heavy iron key turning in the deadbolt was always the exact moment the day's weight shifted from the grinding survival of the city to the sacred boundary of his home. Sophia was sitting at the scuffed oak kitchen table, surrounded by colored pencils and open library books. Her dark hair was still held by the slightly lopsided pigtails he had fixed for her that morning. She did not look up immediately, but her 7-year-old instincts were incredibly sharp. Children of single parents learn to read the posture of a room before they ever learn to read chapter books. "You're breathing loud, Daddy," Sophia said, her green crayon scraping softly against the paper. "Did a bad customer yell at you?" Nathaniel walked over, placing his large, calloused hand gently on her shoulder, feeling the fragile warmth of his entire universe. "Just a complicated day, sweetheart. I told someone a truth they weren't entirely ready to hear." "Was it a mean truth?" "No," Nathaniel murmured, pulling up a mismatched wooden chair beside her. "It was a truth that could change everything for them. But sometimes, people with a lot of money like they're old, lies better." Sophia stopped drawing, looking up at him with her large, serious eyes. "If it's the truth, you have to say it anyway. That's what you told me when Mommy went to heaven." Nathaniel offered her a small, tired smile, his heart aching with a familiar mixture of immense pride and financial dread. He had spent 3 grueling years as a physical rehabilitation assistant at the Meridian Rehabilitation Center, learning the intricate, silent language of human muscles before his wife Claire's terminal illness had forced him to drop out to become a full-time caregiver and father. He knew what he had seen in that boardroom. He knew the clinical difference between dead tissue and deep, suppressed neural dormancy. At precisely 8:15 that evening, while Sophia was in the bathroom brushing her teeth, Nathaniel's phone buzzed against the worn Formica kitchen counter. It was a text message from his central dispatch manager. "Courier 402, your contract is indefinitely suspended effective immediately. A formal executive misconduct complaint has been filed against you by the office of the senior vice president at Whitmore Access. Do not return to the depot." Nathaniel stared at the small screen. The specialized reading clinic tuition fee for Sophia was due in exactly 10 days, and his bank account was almost hollow. He closed his eyes, took a single, deep, chest-expanding breath, and set the phone face down. His masculinity was not built on outbursts or anger, it was built on endurance. He walked into the bathroom, gently took the towel to wipe the toothpaste from his daughter's chin, and smiled as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, on the 42nd floor of the Whitmore Tower, the rain continued to lash violently against the glass. Ava sat in the pitch-black darkness of her private office, the city lights below casting long, fractured shadows across the ceiling. Her uncle Charles had spent 3 hours trying to convince her to file a restraining order against the courier company, but she had dismissed him with a single, icy wave of her hand. She was holding an old, yellowed medical file from the night of the automobile accident 20 years ago. Her father, Thomas, had died instantly when the speeding truck hit their vehicle. She had woken up to the blinding lights of the ICU and the authoritative, comforting voice of Dr. Richard Cole, the family's trusted chief neurologist. He had told her she would never feel her lower body again. She had believed him blindly. But tonight, for the first time in 2 decades, Ava looked past the typed medical summaries. She flipped to the very back, finding the messy, handwritten intake notes from an emergency room resident who had long since left the hospital system. Deep in the margins, a faded line of ink caught her eye. Patient shows localized bilateral reflex reaction to deep sensory stimulus in left lower extremity prior to secondary sedation. Possible incomplete trauma presentation. Recommend immediate secondary exploratory imaging before surgical fixation. That secondary imaging had never happened. The very next morning, Dr. Richard Cole had rushed her into a major spinal stabilization surgery, and the definitive diagnosis of complete permanent paralysis was written into her life forever. Ava's hand began to tremble, a rare and terrifying breach in her iron corporate armor. She pressed the intercom button on her desk, her voice slicing through the silent office like steel. "Hannah," Ava whispered to her loyal personal assistant, "track down that delivery driver. I want to know every single detail about the life of Nathaniel Hayes by tomorrow morning." The bell above the door of the Oak and Grain Bakery chimed softly as the afternoon rush began to thin. Located just 3 blocks from Elmwood Academy, the high-end establishment was filled with wealthy parents and executives from the nearby medical district. Nathaniel sat in a corner booth, a cup of black coffee cooling in front of him. Sophia sat opposite him, happily coloring a picture of a giant, multicolored tree. He had spent the last 2 hours visiting independent courier hubs, searching for any immediate freelance work to cover his missing income, but his name had already been flagged in the local dispatch registry. Charles Whitmore's reach was long. Despite the invisible walls closing in on his finances, Nathaniel's face showed nothing but absolute serenity for his daughter. He adjusted the collar of her school sweater, his large hand a shield against the cold world outside. The atmosphere in the bakery shifted instantly when the heavy glass doors opened. 2 security guards stepped in first, scanning the room before holding the door open for Hannah Brooks, who guided Ava Whitmore's carbon fiber wheelchair over the threshold. Ava wore a tailored camel hair coat, her dark hair pulled back perfectly, her expression radiating an intimidating, icy authority that made the cashiers instantly freeze. She didn't look at the menu. Her piercing blue eyes locked onto the corner booth. As Ava approached, the wealthy patrons whispered, recognizing the billionaire executive. Nathaniel did not stand up, nor did he look intimidated. He placed a gentle, reassuring hand over Sophia's coloring book. Before Ava could speak, Sophia looked up. Instead of shrinking away from the cold aura of the powerful woman, the little girl's face lit up with pure, uncomplicated curiosity. She looked at the sleek, matte black structure of Ava's wheelchair. "Wow," Sophia said, her voice bright and innocent in the quiet cafe. "Your chair looks like a spaceship. Is it super fast?" Hannah gasped slightly, moving to step back, but Ava froze. For 20 years, people looked at her wheelchair with pity, political deference, or clinical detachment. No one had ever called it a spaceship. Ava looked down at the little girl, her lips tightening into a thin line, trying to maintain her rigid executive control. But her hands resting on her lap trembled slightly. "It goes as fast as I need it to," Ava replied, her voice dropping its sharp boardroom edge, replaced by a rare, guarded vulnerability. "My daddy fixes things that are broken," Sophia said proudly, holding up a green crayon. "He fixed my doll's leg with special glue. He can fix anything." Nathaniel gently patted Sophia's head. "Sophia, sweetheart, why don't you go ask the nice lady at the counter for a box for your pastry?" Sophia smiled, grabbed her plate, and skipped toward the counter. The moment she was out of earshot, the warmth drained from the space. Ava leaned forward, her face hardening once more, the cold CEO returning to the surface. "Who paid you, Mr. Hayes?" Ava demanded, her voice a low, lethal murmur. "Did a rival logistics firm give you access to my private medical files? Or did my Uncle Charles push you to create a scene that would destabilize our stock before the quarterly audit?" Nathaniel looked at her, his quiet masculinity completely unaffected by her wealth or her accusations. He didn't raise his voice. He leaned back slightly, his expression open and grounded. "Nobody paid me, Miss Whitmore." Nathaniel said softly, "I don't care about your stock prices, and I don't know your uncle. I care about what is true. You're a delivery driver with a suspended contract. Ava fired back, her eyes flashing with a desperate kind of anger. You expect me to believe you diagnosed a 20-year-old spinal injury across a crowded boardroom based on a single vibration? I spent 3 years working at the Meridian Rehabilitation Center before my life changed, Nathaniel explained, his voice steady and calm. I've seen hundreds of spinal presentations. When that door slammed, your bilateral trunk stability engaged automatically to keep your posture straight. A completely paralyzed body doesn't do that. Your nervous system isn't dead, Miss Whitmore. It's trapped behind a wall of deep tissue dormancy and 20 years of muscle memory that was deliberately turned off. Ava's breath caught in her throat. The exact phrase he used, deep tissue dormancy, was identical to the specialized medical warning she had found hidden in the margins of her emergency intake file the night before, a file that had been buried in a secured vault for 2 decades. Before she could process the shock, the bakery's front door was violently thrown open. Dr. Richard Cole strode into the cafe, flanked by 2 corporate lawyers. His face was flushed with anger, his usual polished, authoritative demeanor completely unraveled. He marched directly toward their booth, his eyes glaring at Nathaniel with pure venom. Ava, step away from this scam artist immediately. Doctor, Cole commanded, his voice echoing through the establishment. This man is a criminal attempting to exploit your tragedy for a financial payout. I have already drafted the permanent injunction. Nathaniel stood up slowly, his tall, powerful frame completely overshadowing the furious doctor. He didn't look angry, he looked dangerously steady. I haven't asked for a single dime, Doctor, Nathaniel said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that filled the room. But the fact that you showed up here with lawyers instead of a medical chart tells me everything I need to know about what you're hiding. Dr. Cole opened his mouth to shout, but Ava suddenly held up her right hand. The sheer authority in her silent gesture made the entire room stop. She didn't look at the doctor. She was looking at Nathaniel, her heart pounding against her ribs as she realized the terrifying truth. Mr. Hayes, Ava said, her voice shaking with an emotion she hadn't felt in 20 years. If what you are saying is true, what happens next? Next, we find a doctor who doesn't work for your family's foundation, Nathaniel said down to her, his eyes offering a profound sense of emotional security she didn't know existed. Suddenly, a loud, agonizing crash shattered the conversation from the front of the bakery. Sophia had tripped near the heavy display cases, a large glass jar shattering across the floor right next to her feet, leaving her trapped amidst jagged shards of glass. Sophia let out a terrified, piercing scream. Nathaniel moved instantly, but before he could reach her, Ava instinctively threw her upper body forward, her hands gripping the table as her left foot violently slammed against the metal footrest of her wheelchair, moving entirely on its own. The sharp ring of shattering glass echoed through the bakery, followed instantly by Sophia's terrified cry. Shards of thick ornamental jars lay scattered like a minefield around her small canvas sneakers. Ava gasped, her upper body straining forward so violently that the frame of her wheelchair groaned. For a single agonizing fraction of a second, the raw impulse to protect a child had bypassed 20 years of deadened pathways, forcing her left foot to slam down against the metal footrest with visible, unguided force. But the spark vanished as quickly as it had ignited. The weight of her paralysis slammed shut again, leaving her pinned to her seat, breathless and trembling. Ava's iron executive control cracked entirely. She looked at Sophia, who was sobbing, clutching her scraped elbow, surrounded by jagged edges of green and clear glass. For all her billions, for all her logistics networks and corporate boardrooms, Ava felt completely, horrifyingly helpless. The room seemed to warp around her. The whispers of the patrons faded into a high-pitched hum of panic. She tried to yell for Hannah, to order her security guards to move, but the words caught in her throat. Her hands shook violently against the armrests. She had everything money could buy, yet in this room filled with broken glass and a crying child, she possessed absolutely no power to offer safety. Then Nathaniel moved. While Dr. Cole retreated a step to protect his expensive wool suit, and the lawyers froze in indecision. Nathaniel stepped forward with absolute, grounded serenity. His boots crunched deliberately over the heavy shards. He did not rush, he did not panic, and he did not raise his voice. He simply knelt directly into the debris, completely ignoring a sharp piece of glass that sliced into the leather of his shoe. His large, powerful arms reached out, lifting Sophia seamlessly into his chest. "I've got you, sweetheart," Nathaniel murmured, his deep voice carrying a steady, rhythmic warmth that acted like a physical shield against the chaos. "Take a deep breath. Daddy's right here. You're completely safe." Sophia buried her tear-stained face into the collar of his faded canvas jacket, her frantic breaths instantly beginning to slow as she synchronized with her father's calm, unyielding heartbeat. He carefully inspected her palms and arms for cuts, brushing away tiny flecks of dust with a gentle precision that made his massive hands look like those of a surgeon. The contrast was undeniable. The entire cafe watched in absolute silence, captivated by the quiet masculinity of a man who required no authority or title to command a room. Ava watched them from her chair, her breathing shallow. The sight of the little girl trusting him so instantly, without an ounce of hesitation, struck a chord deep within her guarded chest. She had spent 2 decades surrounded by men who spoke in calculated statistics, men who measured safety in insurance policies and legal indemnities. Yet this delivery driver, facing financial ruin and public scrutiny, provided absolute emotional security without even trying. For the first time in her adult life, Ava felt the profound emptiness of her empire. She has everything, she thought, her hands still trembling against her knees, except peace. Doctor. Richard Cole, sensing the shift in the room's energy and desperate to regain control of the narrative, stepped forward, his face twisted in a mask of professional outrage. "This is exactly what I warned you about, Ava," Cole shouted, gesturing aggressively toward Nathaniel. "Look at this display!" This man is a reckless, incompetent fraud who brings his own child into high-end establishments to stage accidents. He's desperate. His contract was suspended because of his unstable behavior, and now he's using his daughter as a prop for an extortion scheme. One of the corporate lawyers stepped up, pulling out a smartphone. "We are contacting law enforcement immediately. A formal complaint for child endangerment and corporate harassment will be filed before the hour is out." Nathaniel stood up slowly, keeping Sophia tucked safely against his shoulder. He turned to face Dr. Cole, his expression completely devoid of fear or anger. His quiet gaze held a terrifying level of clarity that made Cole's chest heave. "You can call whoever you like, Doctor," Nathaniel said softly, his voice echoing clearly through the crowded bakery. "But while you were busy shouting about lawsuits and my bank account, you completely missed what just happened right in front of you. You missed the clinical reflex." Dr. Cole's face went pale, his eyes darting quickly down to Ava's feet before snapping back up. His hands aggressively shoved into his coat pockets, but not fast enough to hide the sharp tremor in his fingers. There was no reflex. It was a postural spasm, a common involuntary artifact of long-term trauma. Cole hissed, his voice rising to an unnatural pitch. He turned back to Ava, his demeanor shifting into a suffocating, authoritative patronization. "Ava, we are leaving right now. This environment is causing severe psychological distress and triggering phantom neurological responses. I am ordering an immediate transfer to the private wing at Street Lay, Jude's Medical Center for deep sedation and a full psychiatric evaluation. Hannah, wheel her out." Hannah Brooks didn't move. She stood behind the wheelchair, her eyes darting between Ava's rigid form and Nathaniel's steady gaze. The corporate lawyers stepped closer to Ava, their shadows falling over her. The pressure in the room was suffocating, an entire system of wealth and medical authority closing in to bury the truth once again. Ava looked up at Dr. Cole, noticing the frantic sweat breaking out along his hairline, and then she looked at Nathaniel, who stood perfectly still, a silent mountain of truth. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, her voice cutting through the heavy air with a cold, terrifying precision. "Touch my chair, Richard, and I will have you removed from my building by the police." Dr. Cole stepped back, his face darkening into a mixture of offense and calculated malice. The 2 corporate lawyers lowered their phones, looking toward the bakery's exit as patrons began to openly stare. The absolute authority in Ava's voice had sliced through the doctor's psychological trap, but the battle lines were now drawn in the open. Cole adjusted his cuffs, his voice dropping into a venomous whisper. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, Ava. You are choosing the word of a disgruntled courier over 20 years of elite medical science. When the board hears about this public breakdown, I will not be able to protect your position." "I don't need your protection anymore, Richard," Ava said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "Hannah, we are leaving. Get the car." 10 minutes later, the rain slammed against the reinforced glass of Ava's luxury executive SUV as it pulled away from the curb. Inside, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the tires against the wet asphalt. Nathaniel sat across from Ava in the spacious passenger cabin, his large frame filling the leather seat, holding a quieted, resting Sophia against his chest. The little girl had exhausted herself from crying and was now deeply asleep, her small hand tightly gripping the fabric of her father's faded jacket. Ava watched them from her stationary position. The contrast between her immense billion-dollar corporate power and the raw, uncomplicated safety Nathaniel provided his daughter was blinding. She looked down at her own hands, which were still cold, still trembling slightly from the phantom adrenaline of her foot's sudden reflex. The fracture of power. Ava leaned forward, her eyes scanning Nathaniel's calm, unreadable face. "You aren't just a physical therapy assistant, Mr. Hayes. A regular medical aide doesn't stand down a chief neurologist without blinking. Who are you?" Nathaniel looked out the window at the passing city lights, his expression grounded in a quiet, solemn masculinity. "Before my wife got sick, and before I took the delivery routes to stay close to Sophia, I flew combat rescue helicopters for the elite tactical medical division," Nathaniel said softly, his voice a low rumble. "In that line of work, you don't look at charts or insurance policies. You learn to read the human body under extreme trauma in seconds. You look for the microcellular responses that tell you if a soldier is giving up or if their nervous system is just in shock, waiting for a signal to wake up." Ava felt a chill run down her spine. The missing puzzle pieces of his character suddenly locked into place: the hyper-observant gaze, the unbreakable posture under Charles's insults, the utter lack of fear in the face of corporate threats. He wasn't a man looking for a payout. He was a highly trained specialist who had seen the raw edge of life and death. "Your uncle and Dr. Cole didn't just misdiagnose you, Miss Whitmore," Nathaniel continued, looking directly into her eyes. "They managed you. They used heavy sedatives during your early recovery to suppress those natural neural sparks, and they kept you in a rigid immobilization loop. They built a cage out of medical terminology and convinced you that you belonged in it." The corporate trap closes. Before Ava could respond, a sharp, repetitive chime broke the silence of the cabin. Hannah's tablet was flashing with urgent, red alerts. The assistant's face went completely pale as she read the incoming encrypted transmissions from the Whitmore Access headquarters. Emergency resolution filed. Charles Whitmore had officially invoked Article 9 of the corporate bylaws, calling for an immediate, closed-door board session at 2 p.m. the following day. Competency review initiated. The filing alleged that Ava was suffering from severe psychological distress, presenting affidavits signed by Dr. Richard Cole, claiming she was unfit to make executive or personal medical decisions. Asset freezes looming. The legal team was already moving to temporarily freeze her unilateral corporate accounts pending a formal competency hearing. "They're moving faster than we thought, Ava," Hannah said, her hands shaking as she pulled up the tracking metrics. "Charles has already contacted the major institutional invecurity. They are framing your interaction at the bakery as a medical crisis caused by an extortionist. They're trying to lock you out of your own building before you can even get a second opinion." Ava's jaw tightened. The empire she had spent 20 years building from her chair, the logistics networks, the global medical supply lines was being turned into a weapon against her by her own blood. She was being cornered, hunted within the walls of her own company. She looked at Nathaniel, the physical pressure of the room suffocating her. For the first time, the cold, untouchable CEO looked genuinely vulnerable. Her breathing hitched as the walls of 20 years of deception closed in. Nathaniel reached out, his large, steady hand hovering just inches above hers, not touching, but offering an unbreakable boundary of emotional security. "They are moving fast because they are terrified, Miss Whitmore. When a liar realizes the truth is out of the bag, they don't stop lying, they just start screaming louder. We need an independent neurosurgeon who doesn't answer to your uncle's money, and we need them tonight." Ava swallowed hard, looking at the sleeping Sophia, then back to Nathaniel's steady eyes. "I know one," she whispered. "Dr. Chloe Mercer. She was blacklisted by my uncle's foundation 5 years ago because she questioned our rehabilitation protocols. If anyone can find the truth without fear, it's her." Nathaniel nodded once, his face hardening into the resolute expression of a man stepping back onto a battlefield. "Then tell your driver to change course. The storm is getting worse, and we're running out of time." The independent clinic of Dr. Chloe Mercer sat on the quiet outskirts of the city, housed in a stark brick building completely detached from the multi-billion-dollar shadow of the Whitmore family foundation. By midnight, the storm outside had settled into a low, steady drone. Inside the private examination room, the atmosphere was thick with clinical urgency. Sophia was fast asleep on a vinyl sofa in the corner, covered gently by Nathaniel's canvas jacket. Dr. Mercer, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stared at the real-time imaging monitors. She had spent the last 2 hours running non-invasive diagnostic sweeps over Ava's lower spine, bypassing the standard medical protocols that had dictated Ava's life for 2 decades. Nathaniel stood quietly by the window, his large frame casting a protective shadow, his eyes reflecting the deep gravity of the moment. Chloe pulled off her glasses, her hands steady, but her expression grim as she turned to Ava. The corporate armor Ava wore so well seemed incredibly fragile in the harsh fluorescent light of the clinic. Nathaniel was right, Ava, Chloe said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made the room feel suddenly smaller. The original trauma from the accident was severe, but it was never a complete severing of the spinal cord. It was an incomplete lesion. Your neural architecture is fully intact. Ava gripped the edges of the examination table, her breathing catching. Then why haven't I felt anything for 20 years, Chloe? Why has it been completely dead? Because you were never allowed to heal, Chloe replied, pointing to a dark, dense shadow on the digital scan. Right after your first emergency surgery, Dr. Cole administered high-dose neurosuppressive injections, claiming they were for localized pain management. But the dosage levels were designed to force your nervous system into permanent dormancy. They literally turned off the lights in your lower body, and by keeping you immobilized in a rigid chair without targeted muscle stimulation, your pathways fell into a deep, functional sleep. Your body didn't fail you. You were managed into stillness. A tear slipped silently down Ava's pale cheek, a rare and agonizing display of raw vulnerability. 20 years of grief, 20 years of believing her own body was a broken cage, shattered into pieces in a matter of seconds. She looked up at Nathaniel. He didn't offer a patronizing look of pity. His steady, grounded gaze gave her an unyielding sense of emotional security, a silent assurance that she was no longer alone in the dark. "They didn't want you to walk, Ava," Nathaniel said quietly from the window. "A billionaire heiress confined to a chair needs a proxy to run her world. Your uncle didn't see a niece who needed to be saved. He saw an empire he could control from the passenger seat." Ava wiped her face, her jaw tightening as the profound sorrow in her chest instantly forged into a cold, lethal fury. The emotional weakness vanished, replaced by the terrifying resolve of a woman who had just found her footing in the universe. "Hannah," she whispered into her phone. "Assemble the forensic financial audits for the morning. We are going to the boardroom." By 1:50 the following afternoon, the main executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Whitmore Access Tower was packed to its absolute capacity. A sea of expensive wool suits, high-powered institutional investors, and legal representatives sat in tense silence around the court's table. Large projection screens displayed the emergency corporate resolution drafted by Charles Whitmore. Charles stood at the podium at the head of the room, his posture tall, radiating a calculated air of solemn tragedy. Beside him stood Dr. Richard Cole, holding a leather-bound medical dossier, looking every bit the authoritative savior of the family legacy. "This is the most painful moment of my professional and personal life," Charles announced into the microphone, his voice dripping with theatrical sorrow. "My brilliant niece, Ava, has succumbed to the immense, crushing psychological pressure of her physical limitations. Yesterday, in a public establishment, she suffered a severe emotional break, completely falling under the influence of a dangerous, disgruntled former delivery driver who is attempting a massive extortion scheme. For the protection of the company, and for Ava's own medical safety, we must invoke Article 9 and transition executive authority immediately." The investors whispered among themselves, nodding grimly. Dr. Cole stepped forward, adjusting his glasses to read his signed medical affidavit, ready to seal Ava's corporate execution with his elite medical authority. "As her chief neurologist for 2 decades, Cole began, I can definitively state that Miss Whitmore is experiencing severe phantom cognitive distortions. Her insistence that she possesses lower motor function is clinically impossible, and her refusal of treatment requires immediate, involuntary psychiatric containment." Suddenly, the heavy, double-reinforced mahogany doors at the back of the boardroom clicked open. The sound cut through the microphone's feed like a gunshot. The entire room turned their heads in unison. Ava Whitmore entered the room. She was not tucked away in her standard medical chair, nor was she wearing her usual dark corporate colors. She wore a striking, pure white blazer, her eyes flashing with a terrifying, absolute clarity that made the front row of lawyers instinctively shrink back. Behind her walked Hannah Brooks, carrying a stack of encrypted digital drives, and beside them stood Nathaniel Hayes, his towering, powerful frame commanding the space without saying a single word. The boardroom erupted into an intense, chaotic murmur. Charles's face instantly drained of all color, his hands gripping the edges of the podium so tightly the wood groaned. "Doctor." Cole choked on his next syllable, his eyes darting frantically toward the door as the carefully constructed illusion of 20 years began to violently unravel in front of a live audience. Charles Whitmore's voice shook as he screamed for the security team, but the guards in the back of the room stayed completely still. They looked at Ava, whose piercing eyes held the absolute authority of the woman whose name was etched into the very steel of the building. They knew exactly who signed their pay charts. Hannah Brooks moved with flawless, calculated efficiency, laying a sleek digital tablet in front of every single board member simultaneously. On the high-definition screens, a devastating paper trail began to scroll in real time. "What is the meaning of this, Charles?" one of the lead institutional investors demanded, his voice slicing through the boardroom murmur as he stared at the financial data. Ava did not look at her uncle. She kept her eyes locked on the collective board. "What you are looking at," Ava said, her voice a low, chilling melody that commanded total silence, "is 20 years of systematic medical and corporate treason." Hannah explained the documents with clinical precision. The original emergency room residence notes from the night of the automobile accident. The hidden imaging files proving Ava's trauma was an incomplete lesion. And finally, the definitive, crushing blow. A 14-year history of multi-million-dollar consulting payments transferred from the Whitmore Family Foundation directly into Dr. Khan. Richard Cole's private offshore accounts, all authorized and signed exclusively by Charles Whitmore. Dr. Cole's face turned an ash-gray color. He stumbled backward against the projection screen, his leather-bound dossier slipping through his frantic fingers and scattering across the floorboards. "These are fabricated, decontextualized fragments. You are experiencing a profound psychological delusion, Ava." "The bank routing numbers do not lie, Richard," Ava said softly, her tone colder than the ice outside. Charles tried to step toward the head of the table, his arrogant demeanor completely fracturing into a desperate, sweating plea. "Ava, please listen to me. Everything I did was to protect you, to protect the stability of this great empire. A woman in your physical condition." "My condition," Ava interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuse like a razor, "was deliberately manufactured by you." The room fell into a suffocating, heavy silence. The investors stared at Charles with cold disgust. The corporate power dynamic had completely inverted, but the true cinematic climax of the afternoon was yet to come. Ava looked at Nathaniel, who stood just behind her right shoulder. His towering, powerful frame remained perfectly still. He did not say a word, but his steady, grounded presence gave her an unyielding sense of emotional security she had never known in a boardroom. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a push. It was a promise that if she fell, he would be the mountain that caught her. Ava placed both of her palms flat against the smooth, cold quartz of the conference table. The executives leaned forward, their breath catching in their throats. With an immense, visible concentration, Ava strained her upper body. Her jaw tightened, the muscles in her forearms flexing as she commanded her lower limbs to do what they had been prevented from doing for 2 decades. It was not a graceful, effortless movement. It was a grueling, agonizing battle against 20 years of enforced dormancy and deep tissue stiffness. Her knees trembled violently beneath her tailored clothing. Her left foot pressed flat against the floor, finding real, solid leverage. Slowly, inch by inch, Ava Whitmore rose completely out of her carbon fiber wheelchair. The boardroom erupted into a collective, stunned gasp. Several investors stood up from their seats in sheer disbelief, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor. Dr. Cole looked as if he had just seen a ghost, his mouth hanging open, his entire elite medical career vaporizing in a single second. Ava stood fully upright at the head of the table. She did not use the support of a cane. She braced her trembling fingers lightly against the edge of the quartz table, her chest heaving from the sheer physical exertion, but her eyes were perfectly level with the room for the first time in 20 years. 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. The silence was absolute, a holy reverence gripping the multi-billion-dollar room. She stood unassisted for 14 long, undeniable seconds, proving her absolute physical and mental competence to the entire world. "I believe," Ava said, standing tall, looking directly at the trembling old man who had stolen her youth. The question of my executive competency has been definitively answered. She carefully lowered herself back into her seat, her muscles exhausted, but her spirit entirely untouched. Effective immediately, Charles Whitmore is stripped of his title and removed from the board of directors for gross breach of fiduciary duty. Doctor. Richard Cole's medical advisory contract is terminated, and a formal criminal referral for medical fraud and corporate conspiracy has already been filed with the federal authorities. She looked at the stunned crowd of investors. We will now proceed with the quarterly review. I believe we are behind schedule. 2 hours later, the grand boardroom was completely empty. The investors had filed out in a state of shock. The corporate lawyers had scrambled to distance themselves from Charles, and law enforcement had already escorted Dr. Cole out through the basement loading dock. The heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving the afternoon sky a pale, clean silver over the financial district. Ava sat alone at the massive table, her white blazer reflecting the cool light of the panoramic windows. The immense corporate fury had subsided, leaving behind a deep, hollow exhaustion. The 20 years of stolen life could not be bought back by a board vote. Nathaniel walked back into the room, holding 2 simple paper cups of warm tea from the lobby kiosk. He walked over and placed one in front of her, then leaned his tall frame against the edge of the glass windows, looking down at her with that same calm, unhurried masculinity that had anchored her through the storm. Ava looked up at him, her eyes soft, the fierce CEO persona completely melting away to reveal the emotionally human woman underneath. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely lift the cup. "I did it," she whispered, her voice cracking with a sudden, overwhelming wave of raw emotion. I stood up. "I saw," Nathaniel said softly, his deep voice radiating a profound respect. "You fought for your life today, Ava." She looked down at the dark liquid, a single tear falling into the paper cup. "But 20 years are gone, Nathaniel. My father is gone. The people I trusted with my life built a cage around me, and I lived in it. How do I even begin to rebuild a life after that?" Nathaniel stepped closer, his presence immediately filling the space with an undeniable warmth and security. He didn't offer a hollow corporate platitude. He simply knelt beside her chair, putting his eyes level with hers, his large, steady hand resting on the arm of her seat, providing safety without even trying. "You didn't live in it willingly," Nathaniel said, his voice a steady anchor for her fracturing heart. "You lived in the truth you were given, but today, you broke the lock. You don't have to rebuild 20 years in a single afternoon. You just have to focus on the next step." Ava looked into his steady eyes, feeling a strange, unfamiliar sensation blooming in her chest. Not the cold drive of business, but a deep, emotional connection to a man who wanted absolutely nothing from her wealth. A man who saw her humanity before her power. The emotional chemistry between them was tangible, growing naturally out of a shared battle. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she tentatively touched the faded canvas sleeve of his jacket. "You lost your career, your contract, and you risked everything for a stranger. Why did you stay, Nathaniel?" Before Nathaniel could answer, the heavy boardroom doors suddenly swung open again, and Hannah rushed into the room, her face tight with a brand new expression of shock that made both of them instantly turn. Hannah's breath was ragged, her voice cracking under a psychological weight that corporate crises could never produce. "Ava." Charles escaped the federal marshals down the private service elevator. He bypassed the lobby and went to the 41st floor executive lounge. He took Sophia. He's heading for the rooftop helipad right now, forcing his private pilot to start the rotors before the airspace is restricted. The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. Ava's face went entirely translucent, her newly reclaimed executive composure instantly vaporizing into a raw, helpless terror. The shadow of her deepest trauma, the sudden, violent loss of her father, the absolute physical helplessness of an 18-year-old girl trapped in a twisted vehicle wreckage, slammed back into her consciousness with suffocating force. She began to hyperventilate, her fingers clawing frantically at the smooth quartz table. For all her billions, for all her global medical logistics networks, she was entirely paralyzed by a wave of emotional panic. "No, no, not her," Ava cried out, her voice shrinking into a vulnerable, trembling sob. "He's going to kill her, Nathaniel. He's completely desperate. He knows his life is over. I can't. My legs won't move fast enough. I can't stop him." In the center of her spiraling panic, Nathaniel Hayes remained completely motionless, a towering pillar of absolute, unyielding certainty. The chaotic energy of the boardroom seemed to bend and flatten against his quiet masculinity. His chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic cadence. He did not shout. He did not curse. He stepped forward, kneeling directly in front of Ava's chair, and placed his large, warm hands firmly over her trembling shoulders. The physical connection was an instant, unbreakable anchor. "Look at me, Ava," Nathaniel commanded softly, his deep voice carrying the steady, rhythmic weight of a combat rescue commander who had pulled dying soldiers out of active fire zones. "Breathe. I am right here. Sophia is my entire soul, and I promise you, nobody is taking her away today. Stay in this room with Hannah. Let me handle the air." Nathaniel turned and sprinted toward the emergency service stairwell, his injured left knee completely forgotten under a massive surge of operational adrenaline. When he threw open the heavy steel door leading out onto the 42nd floor rooftop helipad, the wind hit him like a solid wall. The silver afternoon sky was fractured by the blinding, rotating blades of a twin-engine luxury helicopter. The engine was whining, a high-pitched, terrifying scream of fuel burning hot. Charles Whitmore stood near the boarding stairs, his hair wild, his expensive wool suit disheveled, holding a crying Sophia tightly by her wrist. The little girl was terrified, her small eyes scanning the rain-slicked concrete in absolute desperation. The pilot inside the cockpit was visibly waving his hands, pointing at the severe, low-level wind shear alerts on his instrument panel, refusing to lift off into the storm's aftermath. Nathaniel walked out onto the wet tarmac. He did not rush aggressively, knowing that an overt threat might cause a panicked Charles to pull the child into the lethal arc of the tail rotor. Instead, he stepped forward with a slow, terrifyingly deliberate stride, his large frame projecting an aura of absolute dominance. He locked eyes with the pilot through the reinforced glass of the cockpit windshield. Nathaniel raised his right hand, carving a precise, authoritative military aviation hand signal through the air, the universal tactical command for an immediate emergency engine shutdown. The pilot, an Air Force veteran who recognized the flawless, unmistakable execution of an elite commander's directive, did not hesitate. He cut the fuel mixture levers instantly. The high-pitched scream of the turbine engines began to rapidly die down, the massive rotor blades losing their momentum and slowing to a heavy, sweeping crawl. Charles spun around, screaming obscenities into the howling wind, realizing his ultimate escape vector had been completely severed. Before he could recover, Nathaniel closed the distance between them like an avalanche. He placed one massive, calloused hand over Charles's wrist, squeezing with a quiet, crushing force that forced the older man to instantly release his grip. Sophia broke free, throwing her small arms around Nathaniel's neck, burying her face into his canvas jacket. "I've got you, baby," Nathaniel whispered, his voice instantly shifting back into the gentle warmth of a father as he shielded her eyes from the scene. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed across the concrete as a dozen federal marshals and tactical police officers flooded the roof, slamming Charles into the wet deck and clicking the steel cuffs around his wrists for the final time. 6 weeks later, the world had fundamentally reshaped itself into a place of absolute justice. The corporate wreckage of the old regime had been entirely cleared away. Charles Whitmore and Dr. Richard Cole were securely locked behind federal steel, awaiting a criminal trial that would permanently expose their decades of medical fraud and systemic cruelty. The local gymnasium at Elmwood Academy was buzzing with the cheerful chatter of families gathered for the annual Winter Student Showcase. The air smelled of wood floor polish, paper decorations, and fresh pine wreaths. Nathaniel stood near the back wall, wearing a clean, dark, tailored jacket. He was no longer a delivery driver scraping for coins. He was now the officially appointed executive director of the Global Whitmore Patient Advocacy Fund, a position that allowed his profound clinical wisdom and tactical experience to protect thousands of vulnerable patients across the nation. He watched the stage, where Sophia stood in the front row of the children's choir, her dark hair neatly braided, her posture proud and steady. The heavy double doors of the gymnasium opened quietly. Ava Whitmore walked into the room. She was not in her carbon fiber wheelchair. She held a simple, elegant, dark wood cane in her right hand, her movements slow, deliberate, and deeply human. Every single step was a hard-won victory over 20 years of enforced silence, but she did not look down at her feet. She looked only at Nathaniel. As she reached the back row, she stopped beside him. She looked toward the stage, where Sophia had just spotted them, waving both of her hands with a bright, unreserved joy that required no further calculation. Ava raised her hand in return, a small gesture that cost nothing but meant more than her entire billion-dollar empire. The cold, untouchable CEO armor had melted away completely, leaving behind a woman who had finally found her peace. Ava slowly lowered her cane, leaning it carefully against the empty folding chair beside her. She took a deep, steadying breath, stabilized her core, and took 3 slow, completely unassisted steps forward until she was standing directly beside Nathaniel, her shoulder lightly resting against his powerful frame. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a profound emotional closure and a quiet, beautiful hope for a shared future. "You told me once that I just needed to focus on the next step," Ava whispered softly. Nathaniel looked down at her, a gentle, genuine smile breaking across his rugged features. He reached out, his large hand finding hers, wrapping her fingers in a warm, unbreakable grip that provided absolute security without even trying. "And you're doing beautiful, Ava," Nathaniel murmured. On the brightly lit stage, the children's voices lifted into the warm room, while the small, quiet universe they had built together finally found its perfect, peaceful rest.